All right. Well, it is a little after 2, so we're going to get started because I know you'll probably want to go to a 3 o'clock panel too. But as I mentioned, this is providing impactful digital and virtual content. My name is Liz Covart. I'm the founding director of Colonial Williamsburg's Innovation Studios. So we're the department in charge with building Colonial Williamsburg's digital content. And with me, we have 3 excellent historians and history professionals who have digital projects that they're going to tell you about. And you're going to get a wide variety of viewpoints because we're geographically spread out. We work on different types of projects. So hopefully you'll get a pretty broad perspective of opportunities out there in digital space and the types of history you can talk about and communicate digitally. On our panel, we have Christian Weatherspoon from the Atlanta History Center. I'll let them give themselves more formal introductions when they introduce their projects in a moment. John Bickers from Case Western Reserve University, and Mary Michael Stump from the Washington State Historical Society. So if you guys just want to tell everybody who you are and a little bit about your digital work, we can start our conversation.
First, John.
Yeah. Okay.
Ai cheki, te pewe ne olaka koke o wahanungi ka kikwe, amawia wens waane, ni la miamia mitosenia. So I begin today by introducing myself in Miamia Tawenge, the language of the Miami tribe, of which I'm a citizen. I simply said, hi, my name's John Bickers. I'm a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. As Liz said, I'm also a professor of Native American history at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. And so the project I'm coming here to talk about today connects all these. It's called The Ohio Country, and it's examining the history of indigenous Ohio, looking both at the stories of Native peoples pre-contact during the early American period, but also looking at how Ohioans, Native and non-Native, remember Native Ohio, looking at following the removal period, how the stories of Native peoples have continued in Ohio, how they've changed over time. And so in this project, we were interviewing tribal representatives, scholars, local, state and county historical associations, community memory keepers, to develop a larger narrative of Indigenous Ohio, both historically but also contemporarily.
Awesome. Hello, I'm Christian Weatherspoon. As Liz mentioned, I work with the Atlanta History Center, and I am vice president of our digital storytelling department. And so we are a nearly 100-year-old institution. Actually, our centennial coincides with the 250th. And so we started as a smaller historical society and have grown into a mid-sized public history institution over the last 100 years. And, in 2020, our institution made a real commitment around telling undertold stories. And to that point, we created this work, really specifically digital storytelling, to tell these undertold stories. And so that has both been a reflection and acknowledgement of Atlanta and the increased diversity that our city has seen. The neighborhoods and the areas that are around us are increasingly diverse, and our institution needs to be a reflection of that. And so the work that my small team does works directly around that. Our first large-scale project has been a 30-minute documentary film about the untold history of Stone Mountain, the largest Confederate monument in the country. And so I'm happy to talk about that a bit more, but that is a bit about the project.
I can't wait to hear about that. I'm Mary Michael Stump. I'm the Director of Audience Engagement at the Washington State Historical Society, and I'm here to talk with you today about an app that we developed called Black Washington. It is a celebration and commemoration of stories, landmarks, and icons of Black history in Washington State. It's an evergreen project. It continues to grow. It continues to be contributed to by a number of scholars, historians, community members, anyone who really has a story to tell, and the assets to support that, many of which we couldn't access any other way. So Yep. I'll turn it over to you, Liz.
Well, we have a whole range of projects, digital video, digital audio, and apps. I'm wondering if you could reflect on your experiences with your digital projects and talk about the audiences that you're able to reach and how that may have facilitated or hindered your ability to bring them sometimes difficult histories to talk about. So I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your experiences and about the audiences you're able to reach with these histories.
Well, I'll start. As we speak about difficult histories, a bit of more context about my institution. We are, as I mentioned, the project about Stone Mountain. We also house an 1800s painting that was painted in a cyclorama painting that was actually painted in Milwaukee, and it was to reflect the 1864 Battle of Atlanta, which was a Union victory. But when it was relocated to Atlanta, it was rebranded as a Confederate victory. And so we now house that, and we have reinterpreted that painting to tell the real history around lost cause mythology and kind of all the ideology that surrounds that. And we also, thirdly, own the house that Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind in. So we know a thing or two about contentious topics and contentious issues. And so that is a bit of our specialty, right? And so for us, that has looked really, specifically like identifying a target audience for us that is a millennial Gen Z 18 to 40 group that before hadn't really engaged with our institution, but we know that they are having conversations around these contentious topics, right? Especially, something that's as much of a national issue like Confederate monuments and the contextualization of them. And so we've decided, by targeting and identifying that target audience to really lean in, right? To really lean in and to hopefully become a place to facilitate these difficult conversations. And so that was kind of the impetus for us producing this type of content, albeit, contentious. And as our CEO says, we kind of like to grab third rails. And one thing we say a lot at our institution is, people obviously have the right to think what they want to think, to draw their own conclusions, but we all have to start from the same set of facts. And so we see that as our role, especially with that age group specifically, to provide that primary source documentation and actually provide things that, help people come to their own conclusions.
You want to go?
Sure. So it's a really interesting time in teaching Native history, because we've reached a point, at least in Ohio, and I've seen this in other places as well, where I think we all recognize the contentious, the painful nature of Indigenous history, particularly places in the Midwest where tribes were fully removed. Ohio is one of the few states that are no longer any tribes within its borders. All tribes were removed primarily to what's now Kansas and later Oklahoma. And there's an understanding that we need to have those conversations, but people don't seem to have access to that kind of knowledge. There's a thirst for it, there's a want for it, but there's also a sense of they're not really sure where to go to get it. And so one thing I really like about the podcast format is it's really accessible to people. It presents it in a way that they're able to, whether they're driving to work or running on the treadmill or just sitting in the living room, can start to engage in this material at their own pace, at their own level of processing. Because we do talk about some really difficult and painful topics and things that you might not want to just kind of binge listen to and you might want to sit and process with. But that there's a hunger for it, there's a thirst for that information, and they're not always sure where to find that. And so by partnering with local institutions, by partnering with tribal nations, we're able to kind of reach a broader Native and non-Native audience, and to be able to tell these kind of narratives in a way that does justice to the past and honors the facts, but also presents this information in a way that is digestible and understandable, and hopefully is the beginning of their journey, not the end. Hopefully they listen to us interviewing, let's say, a Native historian talking about their work and like, oh, I want to read more about so-and-so. So that engages them further in the process. They now know what trusted sources they can go to for this information. And so it's a really exciting time, but there's this deep hunger. There's just traditionally has not been a lot of open resources. And so it's been really exciting to provide that for people.
Well, the content in Black Washington is not necessarily challenging, although many of the stories can be seen that way, and are painful. But the thing that I think Black Washington does that is really helpful is that they're divided into, like I said, stories, landmarks, and icons, and they create a context for each other. And then there's an education piece to it, also on the app, that is their IDMs that are developed to make connection points between three unique and individual stories. And they ask the person, oftentimes students who are using it, to think about those three stories that might not necessarily be connected, and really interrogate what those connection points are, which further promotes contextual relationships between these isolated stories. So I really think also the real value in this is the depth of individuals that have worked on the app. We have a very strong belief in not about us without us. So we've had, we had an advisory committee of about 20 people, and then we've had about 50 contributors to it thus far, all within the African community in Washington State. So we are just facilitating this on behalf of these local communities who hold these histories.
I was thinking about how to word this. I have a podcast. It's called Ben Franklin's World. It's now an official podcast of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and has been for the last year. And one of my experiences as we cover the whole range of early American history from about 1450 to around 1820, we cover a lot of different topics. And one of the things that I have found is that my inbox has become a safe place for listeners to ask questions that they wouldn't go to a museum or ask anyone in person. And I'm wondering about your experiences with your digital projects as possibly creating a safe space, or maybe you have a different experience with the people who are experiencing your digital work that has been, kind of eye-opening to you, as like, these are possibilities of digital.
I think one of the things I really enjoy about digital platforms in general is I think there can be a really positive aspect to the anonymity of it. That no one, if you don't want to let people know you're listening to this, no one's going to know. Or where you can think about these things in a safer environment. So I've had countless conversations when talking to non-native people about Native history, where they say, "Oh, I don't want to ask a dumb question," or "I don't want to say, this is probably dumb, but," and they're always kind of apologizing for themselves for asking, which is the best thing anyone can do, is to ask a question. And I think digital media has become a really safe way for people to explore these topics that they might not know a lot about in a way that makes them feel comfortable and safe and not feel stupid or not feel like they have to apologize for not knowing, and allows them to kind of do the work themselves to learn this information. So then when they interact with a Native person or interact with someone from whatever community they've been listening to, they can come in with knowledge and come in with a level of respect to that community, and also respect to themselves that they might not have otherwise. So I find it to be a really positive experience.
I think for us, really specifically, we have paired the digital, a lot of our digital content, especially the project I'm talking about around Stone Mountain, with some in-person discussions. And with the idea, the documentary is 30 minutes. It's produced in 5 kind of 4-minute segments. And so the idea is that, people can watch a segment of it, have discussion, watch another segment, have discussion. And what we found is, at the beginning of 2020, before we embarked upon, this broad digital work, we put in place with our institution what we're calling just guiding principles. And those principles lay out specifically how we want to have and facilitate these conversations. And so they are really specific around, this idea of creating a safe space for people to kind of bring their experiences in and, have a space to discuss them. But we are very firm around, things that we will engage in and things that we will not engage in. And that is something that we've applied in the digital space as well. And so we have found that to be, really useful and that people know what to expect, right? Because we know these topics are contentious. We know what they will bring with them. We know what these topics could potentially bring with them. Having kind of those ground rules, if you will, in place for us, we have seen it have a really positive impact on people feeling comfortable engaging. I think one really specific outgrowth that we've seen is after we released the documentary in January of 2023, it was a 3 or 4 month period where we just did some media and tried to raise awareness around it. But we started to get calls from local, cities and counties and local history societies to want to come and do talks about it, right? And so we would invite local historians from communities. We did a couple actually up in Stone Mountain with the Historical Society and the library system there. And we took these guiding principles with us, right? And so it was something that we found, and as a result, we had really engaging conversation around it, and that kind of has been the goal. So that has been helpful for us.
I'm not really sure that, again, I guess we're like the baseball bat of the group, because I'm not sure that question actually applies necessarily, but I will say that this is part of a larger suite of digital projects that can be seen sort of as an a la carte and can be used together with other things or separate, just as a standalone. I do think, I agree with you, John, that the lack of on-ground experience does really help with getting contributions and engagement. And it does provide just a very different access point than an on-ground bricks and mortar experience. So we've really seen engagement grow through this. Some through the use of the app, but really through people being excited and wanting to contribute their own stories. And the challenge is that as those stories are contributed, we talked about, truth earlier. Sometimes we might get 3 stories from 3 different sources, and they vary slightly because different people record their histories, their personal histories, their family histories, their local histories in very different ways. And so those stories that got passed down vary slightly. So we're actually having to come up with some strategies to deal with community-sourced stories and how those things are vetted, because they're all true. And yet there's not necessarily a primary source document to tie that to. So that's been kind of a challenge for this project.
I also find digital projects are great experiments where there's always something to learn from.
Always the thing you didn't think of, right?
And people use the technology in ways you never thought they would use it.
Exactly.
I'm a practical person. In my experience, people are like, it's great for you to do a podcast and to do this digital work, but I'm just a team, I have a very small team, or I'm an executive director of a small site and I do everything. What is the labor and the size team you would need to create a project? And if you don't mind sharing, because sometimes, talking about money is difficult, what is the cost for a museum to kind of get into this work? and put something out there for 2026.
We're fortunate that we were given a $250,000 appropriation to do a project. Originally, the legislator who championed this project and got the money wanted an on-ground exhibition, some sort of party and commemoration. And the advisory committee that we put together said no, they didn't want any of that. They wanted it to be digital. They wanted it to be evergreen. They wanted it to be able to grow. And they wanted a sense of permanency, which I think is interesting, that they wanted a digital tool and they thought of that as permanent. And so we sort of went in that direction. Now, a lot of that was spent paying contributors, paying for the digital, platform itself, other things like that. And we definitely, anybody who contributes to the app, we pay them for their time. We don't ask for anything for free. And so, and then just the, every asset, every video, everything obviously has usage rights and costs money as well. But I would say the ongoing financial commitment to our project is probably about $25,000 a year by the time we pay for, all of the nuts and bolts things and the contributions.
Our situation is a little bit different in that the Ohio Country is being produced by an Ohio radio station affiliate of NPR. And so they have the people and the infrastructure and kind of things set up already when they brought me in. And so for us, a lot of the work is less financial in that sense or structural. It's about relationship building. It's about finding the people, talking to them, working with them. These are people generally not just contacted for this one interview and we've kind of moved on, but these are people that relationships have been built for, in some cases, years. So one of the key interviews in this is Chief Glenna Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and Chief Wallace has been essential in reestablishing Shawnee relationships in the state of Ohio through the government, through the Ohio History Connection, which is the Historical Society, through local county resources. And so her crucial role in this podcast only comes from years of relationship building. Now, not everyone doesn't necessarily take years, but that has become far more important. Being able to build this is developing those relationships, or then going to her and saying, we're going to interview you. Do you know an historian we should interview? Do you know a tribal person we should interview? Kind of using them through the vetting process as well. So it's a slightly different situation. But I imagine for all of us, relationships are kind of key in building anything.
They absolutely are. And, much as you mentioned, ours is really different. I think some of the novelty of the work I get to do at my institution is that I do not have a history background. I'll just say that. I come from a really traditional journalism background. And so kind of at the onset of establishing this department, it was established as a bit of a department with a lot of journalistic qualities, I'll say that. So we work specifically, we have a really small team of three, a researcher that's dedicated to just research for storytelling. And we are not connected necessarily to our archives or our exhibitions team. We are a standalone department within our institution. And so we work specifically around producing 3 to 4 pieces of blog content a month, in addition to one large scale, all-in multimedia project a year. And so we were, very, lucky to receive basically an appropriation from our board to actually start the work within the History Center. And of course, we have become more and more funded and fueled by grant dollars as we move the work forward. But because it was such a
serious commitment that our institution made. We received kind of an initial close to $200,000 appropriation to really just fuel it and get it started. And so we are honestly still figuring out like what funding moving forward looks like. For us, the production of the projects aren't really the expense. It is really just the building of the infrastructure, because we were a mid-sized institution and we had no infrastructure for doing documentaries, for doing videos, for doing podcasts, which I'm working on at this point. So I hope that helps. That's kind of our setup.
And my story has been completely varied. I started Ben Franklin's World at the podcast about early American history as a hobby. I thought I'd write lots of books and articles after graduate school. And my podcast took off. And so for several years, it was a one-woman show, everything done here. Now, since joining Colonial Williamsburg, I have a team of 3. And we produce the show. We're on the very highly produced side. I'd be happy to talk about that later, but it is possible to produce digital media with very small operation. And what I've heard, even though we have very different projects with very different mandates and whatnot, I've heard that relationships, partnerships, partnering with institutions, going maybe after state funding, donor funding, NPR funding, is a way to go. But partnerships, just kind of how we planned this meeting so we could all partner with each other, is kind of key to this work. I do want to move into audience questions, but before I do, I want to address the elephant in the room. At least it felt to me like an elephant in the room last year at Common Cause, which is we don't want 2026 to just be another East Coast holiday where we pat ourselves on the back. So, and part of the logic of this panel was some of your states have no connection with the revolutionary time period, others tangentially, and others still very different with different peoples participating in it. So I was just curious, with these kind of indirect connections or some direct connection to the revolution, how are your organizations thinking about 2026 and maybe using digital content as a way to promote the goals of your organization and to raise civic awareness during the semiquincentennial?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we're not a colonial institution, so we don't have kind of that specific connection. But we have made a decision as an institution to really focus on kind of the aftermath, like what happened after, and this idea of democracy and the importance of democracy is at the top of our list. So much so that we have launched a year and a half ago what we're internally calling now just a democracy initiative. I'm sure it'll have a way slicker name later. But the idea is to kind of use that moniker to really engage people ages 18 to 40 around civic engagement. And what does it look like to be a good citizen outside of just voting, right? And we're using our digital content to work directly around that cause. We are part of a consortium made by us of local history institutions, and we activate with that group the 2-week period between Juneteenth and July 4th in what we call civic season. And again, the idea is that institutions that are part of that, it's either Juneteenth celebrations or July 4th celebrations. Our institution, we have an enormous Juneteenth celebration each year, and it's one of our free public programming days. And so we use that day to really talk to visitors. We welcome over 5,000 to 6,000 people to campus that day. And so we use that time to, again, civically engage people with storytelling, with educational experiences, through a number of different avenues. So that's a bit of our approach.
So I think something that's really important for this podcast and in general for my teaching is reasserting Ohio's importance into the larger early American story and certainly the revolutionary story. There are bits and pieces that you can see. It was actually really cool. Earlier, I was walking through Colonial Williamsburg because I've never been here before, so I want to kind of go and explore. And I got to the main area where they were doing a performance and talking about the imposition of the Intolerable Acts and the dissolution of the House of Burgesses. They were all going to go in and discuss it. And one of the things they mentioned was, Dunmore had dissolved the legislature right before a war with the Shawnee was about to begin, and an Ohio tribe that does culminate in Lord Dunmore's War, which is this massive campaign between the Virginians and the Ohio tribes, primarily the Shawnee. And so it was really cool seeing that kind of reference to Ohio without explicitly being there. But when we talk about Washington, Jefferson, a lot of the Virginian founders, one of their main goals is further expansion west of the Appalachians into the Ohio River Valley. Washington makes the start as a scout for Virginia land companies coming into Ohio in the 1750s. But it's part of that revolutionary narrative that's kind of been lost. I teach a course on Indigenous Ohio specifically, and I love, and a lot of my students, because this is the case, are from Ohio, and I love teaching about the American Revolution because for that course I make it entirely Ohio-centric. And my students, these 18, 20-year-olds, are absolutely floored with the idea that their state was connected to the American Revolution, even though it wasn't one of the 13 colonies, but was still deeply part of the revolutionary rhetoric. It was deeply in the minds of the founders when they're beginning the revolution, and that Native peoples in general were central to this revolution, either siding with the British, siding with the Patriots, or again, with the dispossession of native lands in the minds of the founders. Native peoples are referred to several times in the Declaration of Independence, and not particularly well. But it's reasserting that knowledge to our audience that Native peoples and Native Ohio was absolutely part of the story as well. And in fact, the furthest Western campaign in the Revolution was Clark's campaign, going through Ohio into Indiana, into Illinois, to treat with and engage with tribal nations west of the Appalachians. So Ohio is deeply part of the story, but we've often left it out, unless you're talking about local Ohio history. And so we want to kind of reassert that and bring back Ohio and other Western states back into that, or what was then the West, Western states back into that conversation.
Well, in Washington State, I think we're still contending with exactly what this looks like and what it means. I think it's going to be more questions than answers and statements. And because of that, digital tools are really great for an access point for engagement. I would contend that the East stops at the Cascade Mountains. We have this mountain range that separates Eastern Washington from Western Washington. And I really think that the exploration of place is going to be a really big part of exploring America 250 in Washington State and the strategic location of the Pacific Northwest for opportunity for trade and defense. So I think that really a connection point is going to be in the digital space, just because of how our state is physically divided. And there are times that, schools just don't travel across the mountain passes at certain times of the year. I mean, it sounds sort of, antique, but that's actually, it's a real thing. So while we still don't have all the answers yet, but I'm really anticipating that the digital space is going to play a really key role in connecting all of our communities.
And a shameless plug, one of the things that we'll start working on at Colonial Williamsburg this summer is a short podcast series that looks at the Revolution from west to east. Because you can come here and get all the East Coast stories, or at least East Coast Virginia stories. We don't even know what the Revolution looks like from west to east, because no one's attempted to do that. So we'll be looking at that through that podcast series. Now, I've gotten a chance to ask all the questions I wanted to ask and have them impart information, but what would you like to know? And please hold your question, because I'm also not just the moderator, but the mic runner. So I will bring you a mic so people can hear you. So if you have a question, something you'd like to know, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
Hi, Stacy Ferguson. I work at the Historic Camden Foundation in Camden, South Carolina, and I work at one of those organizations like you talked about. We're very small. We each wear like 8 hats. Mm-hmm. We're light years behind where y'all are at with your digital programs. We're we're trying to learn the bare minimums. So I was just wondering if you had any of you had any advice for establishing a strategy, any good tips for, how we kind of get started with the end goal in mind, because right now we're just kind of getting at it scattershot. Thanks.
I know for us, it was, we're a small organization masquerading as a large organization. We're just one deep in our bench all across the way. So I really do understand that. We develop for each project like this a set of 5 outcomes, each of which connect to each other. And it's really important that we continue to refer to those things. It lets us know how we're doing. They're measurable. Evaluation is a really important part of this. And also it's very easy as you start on a project to sort of go down a rabbit hole here and there, because something will take you to something else. And those outcomes that you spend your time developing, as long as you continue to refer to those, you might say, that's a good idea, but that's not related to this project. I'm going to park that over here and come back to that later. So I would say, spend your time on developing those things up front to continue to give you something to refer to, and also set realistic timelines for yourself. And really develop those relationships that John and Christian have been talking about within your community. Because if you are small, those relationships and contributions that you can get from your community can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I would echo the majority of that. For us, I think it really did push us quicker. Our entire institution got behind it, right? And so we were able to, again, at the very beginning, establish legitimate strategy, so much so that our institution literally changed their strategic plan to include digital content as a pillar. And so with that type of commitment, it kind of made it clear cross-institutionally that it was a priority, and that honestly, we all had to have some contribution to it. And, for the second piece, I would say, we intentionally chose topics that we had the capacity and the resources to talk about. Again, we're a mid-sized institution, but we have our own archives. We have gardens on campus. We're a 33-acre campus. And so we chose topics that we could talk about without a lot of external resources. And so on the front end, that was really helpful for us, because a lot of the things to do, we didn't have to outsource them, because again, we had the expertise in-house. And then lastly, to your point, all of the connections with communities has been critical for us. Even our local public media outlets, they let us borrow space to edit content, right? Because we don't have that kind of infrastructure on campus. And so a large part of it is like raising the awareness that, okay, our institution is doing this, like we're venturing out here, and really just seeing who's open to help. And that has really worked for us.
I guess yes to all of that. And I think the point I would hit, again, really hard, that Christian brought up was choosing something that you can do, choosing a doable project. So as we're working on this podcast, my partners and I talking about this, they're already coming with lists of like, oh, after this we can do this, and after this, you don't have to do everything all at once. And so finding a doable project, whatever size that is for your institution, and understanding in the back of your head, everything else we can get to later. Right. Everything else could be a future project, but you got to get through whatever this one is first.
For sure.
Other questions?
Hi there. My name is Matthew Cagle. I'm from Fort Ticonderoga in far upstate New York. And we look to a lot of digital products, for lack of a better term, because we're in a very rural part of the country. But I wonder a lot, and I wondered if any or all of you might comment on what you see as the longevity of digital projects. How do they go into the future? How do you preserve them? Do you preserve them, or are they just ephemeral for a certain moment in time? And I think this was alluded to earlier about the permanence of these things. And I'd just be curious about how your thoughts, are you thinking ahead about these projects, how they get preserved, how they get advanced, built on, or whether they just move on to something else?
We learned the hard way about that from a website that was developed for women won the right to vote in Washington 10 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. And so there was a suffrage centennial about that statewide. And there was a website developed with flash technology. And all of that got lost when that technology became obsolete. And there are still people that worked on that, public historians that are grieving as we speak somewhere in Washington State. So I think that's a really good question. And it's one I don't have an answer for, I don't think. I think you just, do the best you can at that time. We really back that up with frameworks and, old-fashioned digital archives so that if we needed to rebuild this, we could. We use a product called Culture Connects. We actually didn't build this app separate. And we did that because of our other experience. A bespoke tool didn't work for us in that way. And so we were hoping that through going through a platform that is a commercial product, we were hoping might help that somewhat. Only time will tell about that, but.
I think the unfortunate answer is I don't know. It's an interesting question, but I think whatever the solution is going to be has to be bigger than any individual organization or any individual. It has to be an entire shift within within the world of history, in the world of historical production. And maybe in 10 years, will we have digital historic preservation? Will that be an entire field that will have? I think there's got to be an intentional effort across institutions, across fields, if we are going to preserve these things, because we can do that in that we can digitize VHS tapes. We can, as technology changes, we have found ways of preserving that information, that knowledge in the new formatting. But I think because digital history is still so new and so nascent, we haven't, one, figured out, but two, I think importantly, started thinking about it systematically. And so I'm really glad you asked that question to, again, put that all on all of our brains to start thinking about, like, what do we do when apps are no longer a thing? What do we do when the internet looks like Star Trek? And the answer is I don't know, but we need to start thinking about it. We need to figure out what these larger solutions are, because the answer can't be it's just all gone.
Well, it can be.
Well,
It can be. I think that that's an important thing to say. I mean, it might be, and I 100% agree with you. I think we all need to start wrangling with it. But what our experience was with the suffrage website was, it was heartbreaking. I think the other thing is that when COVID happened, we realized we had zero digital footprint. Yeah. Zero. Everything we were doing was an in-person thing or a history box or some sort of, it wasn't all analog, but there was no access to what we were presenting for somebody who couldn't physically come to the building. And so, we're looking for all kinds of silver linings from COVID, but that was one of them, because we realized that we shifted and did a lot of things, just taught ourselves how to do things. And what we realized is we were able to serve so many more people. And that's when our commitment to digital products, really, really solidified and became a part of our strategic plan as well.
And part of, as I mentioned earlier, for us, part of the grant funding that we are going after now is we have received funding to basically digitize all of our archives to make them accessible. And so alongside kind of producing this wholesale digital content, like digitizing what we have in case those products do go away, at least we have some of the material available and accessible to people. So we are definitely devoting resources to that.
Well, believe it or not, we've already spent 45 minutes doing this. Thank you so much to our panelists for talking about this. If you have more questions, I'm sure they'd be able to answer them after this session or during the course of tonight's fun dinner. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists.